And now, live from England, bringing you news and analysis that you won't find on the corporate and government mainstream media. It's the WideShut Webcast.
Good evening, everyone. You are tuned in to the WideShut Webcast live. I am your host, Keelan Balderson, and you'll probably notice that we're on YouTube, but we're also streaming the show live. That's because they've moved on from the old caveman technology, the old cup and string, and are slowly rolling out their new live event system. And thanks to you guys for actually listening to my stuff, YouTube believe that I'm worthy of the beta test. So let's hope it doesn't all go tits up, because we've got Tom Secker joining us in a few short minutes. If anyone would be kind enough to post a comment at the side of the video to tell me that you can actually hear me, that would be much appreciated. I don't want to be talking to myself. Shout out there to Rambunctious for his Evacuate tune, leading us up to the start of the show there. You can find all of his tracks at SoundCloud/Rambunctious-1. I kind of butchered that. That's soundcloud.com/Rambunctious-1. Rambunctious. I can't even say that word. But that was Rambunctious and Evacuate. Very much appreciate the royalty-free, copyright-lacking music there. Obviously can't play mainstream tracks during this broadcast. Well, I probably could, but I'm pretty sure that would be a quick way to lose this magnificent, honourable privilege of live tubing. And we don't want to do that, because it seemed like an interesting thing that we could get going here. Unfortunately, while we're in the YouTube kingdom, we play by the king's rules. Tonight's show is brought to you by the WideShut UK collection. Head on over to wideshut.co.uk/donate, and for 11 quid you'll be sent a double DVD set of my two documentaries, 7/7 What Did They Know and Perfect Storm, the England Riots. You'll also get MP3s of all of the related webcasts to do with the documentary, so all my 7/7 shows, all my chats with Tom Secker that we've done before, all the Mark Duggan stuff in regard to the riots. You'll get all them as extras on a disc, MP3s. A couple of other videos I think I've put on there. Of course, you can watch and listen to all of that for free on this very channel, but if you do support what I do, then purchasing a DVD would be very, very much appreciated. As I say, coming up in a few short minutes, we have our old friend Tom Secker joining us to discuss his debut book, Secrets, Spies and 7/7. Lots to get into with Tom regarding the new book and also the Woolwich attack. I also want to get into some of his original research on predictive programming, something I haven't really touched on this show before. I know Tom's done some other podcasts discussing the whole predictive programming regarding 7/7, so we're going to get into that. Well, I did do an episode way back, probably one of the very early broadcasts, and I was basically, being a skeptic of the whole concept of predictive programming, mainly because of the way it's presented. Is usually wrapped up with all the Illuminati symbolism stuff, numerology, the habit of picking out 9/11 from films, spotting the all-seeing eye in cartoons, things like that. I guess with anything you can take it to a silly degree, and I was put off by that. A lot of this stuff is very kind of ambiguous, but Tom makes a very convincing case in his book. And it's not even really an argument, more like an observation. The kind of programming that BBC put out before and after the London bombings in 2005 had very similar themes to what took place on 7/7 and what happened after 7/7. So if you strip away the rhetoric, really it all boils down to propaganda for the war on terror. You know, you don't really have to give it any snazzy words or anything. But we'll be getting into that, the book, 7/7 as a whole. Of course, the big story over the last couple of weeks was the tragic stabbing, not beheading as the media first reported, but stabbing to death of the young soldier there, Drummer Lee Rigby. Many of you will have probably read my article on the website, but the beheading meme and the whole media circus surrounding this incident, BBC once again at the helm of that, at the forefront of pushing this reawakening of the war on terror paradigm, which had completely calmed down, at least on this side of the pond. Cameron chaired his Cobra meeting, which is a national security procedure where they all bunker up in a room and plan their next move. It's what they're supposed to do if there's a full-blown terrorist attack that really threatens the day-to-day goings-on of the country. And that's the point, really. I don't like to say that this incident has been exaggerated because I don't want to belittle the poor guy's death, but it has been manipulated by the state, by the media, by the Muslim haters, and also by the loopy pretend extreme Muslims themselves like Anjem Choudhury. And it's all been whipped up to re-legitimise the wars of aggression across the world. And what I mean by that is, at the very beginning, it was called a terrorist attack. They first reported that it was a beheading. You know, that conjures up images of Ken Bigley and Daniel Pearl and the black-flagged beheadings that happen in the Middle East. You had BBC news anchors pretending that, oh, you know, we're over there doing good, fighting the terrorists, and they've attacked us again. And we need to fight the war on terror. And of course, when everyone's been whipped up into this frenzy, the EDL push their agenda, their anti-Muslim rhetoric, and we very much been retrained over the past couple of weeks. It's been restated that we're over in Afghanistan and all these countries for a reason, that there are these terrorists out to get us, and we should support the occupations, and just all that bullshit propaganda. And the remarkable thing is, despite one of the alleged killers standing there in front of a camera, blood on his hands, plainly spelling out why he did it, the mainstream narrative has completely downplayed and misrepresented his point. The West is overseas killing innocent Muslims and other people almost daily. It is daily. And it's all based on lies and distortions, droning families and weddings, people who just happen to be born on that side of the world because somebody near them has been labelled a terrorist without even having any evidence presented in any kind of judicial process. He's a terrorist, we can bomb him, and if anyone's near him, well, that's just collateral damage. Imagine what we'd do if the shoe was on the other foot. Imagine if Australia came over here looking for a criminal who they say bombed a skyscraper in Australia, you know, like Bin Laden. And all of a sudden, men with guns have locked down your town and bombs start falling out of the sky and they call your neighbour a terrorist. And it's ridiculous. Why is there a double standard on human life? Yet all the BBC can say is, you know, well, most people will be looking at this attack and wondering why? Why is this man so angry? We're over there helping in these countries. How do we solve the root problem if we're not even honest about what our troops are doing in these countries? And I say that, but the public, for the most part, understand what's happening. But it's the BBC that are controlling the narrative and therefore controlling the culture, the way people approach this subject. Don't forget that over 1 million people marched against the Iraq war in London. The latest polls show that over 50% of British people want the troops out of Afghanistan. But the BBC never frame it that way. They didn't have a white anti-war activist on Newsnight talking about the massacring of Muslims overseas. They had dipshit Anjem Choudhury on instead, who's supposed to be the leader of the terrorists in this country, but he gets all this friggin' TV time. There's a reason for that, because it makes the narrative us versus them. It takes away the grey areas. It takes away people's reasoned responses. And we'll be getting into some of the dodgy actions of the BBC and MI5, Woolwich, 7/7, and much more with our guest Tom Secker coming up next on the WideShut Webcast. Don't go anywhere.
I think a new world order is emerging, and with it the foundations of
a Great Depression, and I will cry every day. The result of Labour's economic management, your child will have debts among the biggest anywhere at any time in history.
I want to get straight to the point. I'm a second-rate substitute Tony Blair. Let me tell you why I want to be Prime Minister. It's because I want to live in a large, very warm house worth over £1 million. We will never change. We are still the arrogant, callous, ruthless, wicked Tories. And do you know what? We won't help anyone. I will skip across the playground and give the money to the rich, and we'll have a new world order.
WideShut.co.uk. If they won't tell you the truth, we will.
Mm-hmm. And then there was light. As I wanna do. And as I wanna live. Fine. And that's how. Yeah. Just so you know. Ha, yeah, oh man, take your time but don't waste mine, or maybe move your waistline if that's exactly how you're feeling, kids. Make your way through space and time, they say it's so divine when you feel it from inside of your rib. Whatever shape you say you feel is fine, and that's the one I like, so that's the one that you should show to them kids. Take that mask off and socialize, look into my eyes and tell me that's how you want me. See, I stepped in a place, find self seated casually, regal in the air, called her Her Majesty. Only in my mind, my eyes gave a stare tragically as I looked away like you can't have me. Past her natural beauty and an artificial stench, glanced back at me like I committed assault, as if she was supposed to capture me in a rhapsody. Yeah, right, I stroll this tightrope haphazardly. Don't confuse my nonchalance for apathy. That naked shoulder and sparkling cleavage ain't grabbing. This ain't love at first look, we barely good. So how can I accept the flattery happily? Come on, I see you got a song in your walk, but I don't know the lyrics and don't recognize it when I hear it. You need something in the dome for the soldier. She walked straight over, I looked at her and told her, take your time, but don't waste mine. Or maybe move your waistline if that's exactly how you're feeling, kid. Make your way through space and time.
That was True Ingredients with Space and Time. Once again, thanks for the music, everybody. It's much appreciated. But joining me now is our old friend Tom Secker of InvestigatingTheTerror.com and SpyCulture.com. And we can now list author on his resume. You can get his debut book, Secrets, Spies, and 7/7 from Amazon. You can get it on the UK and the US on Kindle. There's also a regular ebook, and if you go to investigatingtheterror.com, you can also get the paperback. And I'd certainly recommend the book to anyone who wants an up-to-date analysis of where we are with 7/7 in terms of the evidence. And really where an honest investigation ultimately leads us, and it certainly isn't where the official story tells us to look. So it's always a pleasure to have you on, Tom. And how are you doing today?
Yeah, thank you. And it's good to be on the WideShut Webcast again. Yeah, I'm great. I'm good. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. Lovely weather today. Bit burned.
Excellent.
So let's jump in then. First off, why a book? You've obviously done two good films on 7/7, which people can get on your YouTube channel, the 7/7 Archive, and I encourage everybody to check those out. But what is it that made you choose a book this time around?
Well, I suppose I'm one of those people who's always wanted to write a book, and it was, I suppose it's just sort of like the next logical step, really. The reason why I made my films was because when I started making them, I didn't feel there were any kind of up-to-date, particularly credible, independent documentaries on 7/7. And as with anything, if you think something should exist and it doesn't, and you can create it yourself, why not? And it's just sort of the same thing with the book. I just felt there needed to be there hasn't been a genuinely good 7/7 book for several years, really, since Nafeez Ahmed's, and that's now, completely out of date, to be honest. So I just felt there needed to be one, and without meaning to blow my own trumpet, who better to write it, really? Because I know an awful lot about this, and I've spent a long time. I mean, one of the things you get when you make a film is you get a lot of feedback, and that lets you know sort of what's getting through, what isn't, what are people enjoying, what are people not, what are people understanding, what are they not, and what people are more interested in, what they'd like to know more of. And since I had a lot more material, I mean, you've read the book now, so there's quite a lot of material in there that wasn't in my films. And so for all those different reasons, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think with a book, I mean, sometimes with a film, you can display things visually, but it's hard for people to kind of follow up. But at least in a book, it's there. You can flick to pages, you can check sources and things like that. So, yeah, I think it's good in that respect. How did the publishing process go? Because sometimes I know these subjects are hard to broach. Did you contact any kind of larger publishing firms? What was their response? Or
I did contact some publishers. I never really held out that much hope of them publishing it, because it's not. I mean, they're a publisher. They're in the business of ultimately selling books, and it's a somewhat obscure topic. It's not that profitable a topic, so therefore I never held out much hope of them being interested in it. I did get a couple of responses from smaller publishers, sort of, if you like, conspiracy publishers, but they were just saying they've got other things that they think are more commercially viable, and that's their decision to make. No one said that they thought it was a bad idea or a bad book, just that that's their business, so that's the decision they made.
And thankfully, with the internet, at least we're starting to get to that point where we can bypass the kind of mainstream publishers, and if you want to go on Amazon and get everything out that way, then you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose it was only logical. Again, I made 2 films that I distributed with YouTube. We are in a position where, at least up to a point, we can kind of self-distribute and self-publish creative works. It's been that way with music for a long time, because of course the file sizes are small enough that you can do it through the internet. I suppose it's only been a few years since we've had Google Video and YouTube and whatnot. But yeah, with the book, and with my plans for future books as well, because you can at least publish ebooks with basically spending no money, yeah, why not?
And I think you've done a very good job with it. Something I mentioned in my review that shouldn't really come as a surprise to anyone who's listened to us before, but you take a very middle ground approach. You obviously don't blindly accept the official government story that the 4 men are guilty and it was Al-Qaeda suicide bombings and so on. But you also aren't your typical conspiracy theorist who might say that, the bombers were duped, it was Peter Powers' terrorist drill, or it was the Jews or whatever. Now, before we get into the idea that perhaps some of these theories may have actually been predicted or seeded in some way, just get into what makes your approach different from, say, the way the state has approached it, or the way the alternative theorists have approached it. In the book, you use the phrase "fixing the intelligence around the policy," and I know both the state and the alternative community have both shown examples of kind of drawing their conclusions before even having the evidence to do so.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my approach is basically just that, this is a crime, first and foremost. This is a mass murder. This is more than 50 people being killed. So, rather than, like any serious investigation or any serious investigator should always resist the temptation to kind of leap in with one or other particular theory, because if you're wrong, you're wasting your time, if for no better reason than that, but also because you can get dragged down cul-de-sacs and you can end up letting people get away with things because you're looking in the wrong direction. And I suppose the difference between my approach and the kind of mainstream approach and most of the alternative is that I resist the ease of just quote mining. I resist that temptation to just trawl through a whole bunch of media reports, and mostly when we're talking about the official narrative and the alternative narratives, it's just media report for not anything that's going on around stuff and stuff. And temptation just sort of trawl through those, looking for the most kind of incriminating quotes you can find, just looking for the most kind of suspicious sounding material that you can get, because that's how so much of conspiracy theorizing, or at least alternative conspiracy theorizing, works. Actually, no, all conspiracy theorizing is just, you pile up suspicious thing, and once you get over about maybe 10 suspicious sounding things, most people will just give up and say, yeah, okay, yeah, you're probably right. And it doesn't really matter what theory you're sticking on the end of that. It's just, if you can build up a general sense of suspicion to a sufficient degree, people will accept what you're saying. And I've got no real interest in doing that. I'm sort of interested in, well, firstly, what actually happened here, but also how can you investigate something when you're completely outside of the state, and, like me, want nothing to do with the state if you can possibly get away with it. But how can you investigate something then? So I looked at, I suppose, the paper trail is an important one, but like you were talking about before the music break, it's also this kind of the cultural media trail that you get. Rather than watching news clips, I was kind of, watching episodes of Spooks and what have you, in order to try and figure out what was the context of this, what was going on in the years around this attack. Because that, once I twigged that there was something to it, I just, I realised that gives you so much a kind of broader impression. It gives you so much more data to work from, and therefore you come up with, I feel, a more subtle conclusion, a more subtle kind of investigation.
And it does seem almost from the beginning. You mentioned sort of confirmation bias. Straight away it was all the hallmarks of Al-Qaeda. Were there all the hallmarks of Al-Qaeda?
No, not at all. Al-Qaeda had no history of doing that sort of thing. Even if you, I suppose, accept the relatively official Al-Qaeda myth, and you say, okay, they were responsible to some degree for the 93 World Trade Center bombing and the embassy bombings in 98 and 9/11 and USS Cole and those sorts of things. None of those were attacks on sort of basic public transport systems. They were all much more symbolic targets. They were diplomatic or economic or military kinds of targets. So the idea that they would be attacking just sort of random people on a bus in London or on tube trains in London, particularly with suicide bombers. If they had suicide bombers in London, why weren't they hitting a much harder target? Why weren't they doing something much more significant than just blowing up a few poor random people? And also, if you just look at the history of terrorism in this country, most of it has been carried out by some form of Irish nationalists or Irish Republicans or something. And in particular, bombings on the tube. There's been lots and lots and lots of bombings on the tube. And and most of them have been carried out by some or other branch of the IRA. So in 2005, if we were actually having a sane sort of instantaneous discussion on the afternoon of 7/7 as to what the history of terrorism might indicate about this attack, then the suspects should have been Irish. They shouldn't have been Al-Qaeda. And, you know, if you get more broadly, again, I suppose you could throw in Gladio. There's an awful lot of the attacks that happened under the sort of umbrella of Operation Gladio that were on public transport, a lot of them particularly on trains. So it has sort of those two feels about it. It doesn't have an Al-Qaeda feel about it at all. So clearly that was a line, that hallmarks of Al-Qaeda thing was a line that was being put out there. And it was put out there astonishingly quickly. I mean, we're talking about within a couple of hours of the explosions, people were already, you know, using that phrase.
Yeah, and going along with that, the authorities identified these guys very quickly. One of the issues you raised in your book was, you know, how they spotted them on the CCTV and the sort of time span of when that happened. I mean, on one hand, obviously MI5 have always said they never really identified them prior to the attacks, but then all of a sudden they finger them, you know, within a few days, and it's these four guys and it was Muslim suicide attacks. Just go into the kind of discrepancies with how they were actually sort of fingered as being the attackers.
Well, it comes from two different places. The first thing is the CCTV, and according to the official reports, they first identified these four guys, these four Muslim chaps carrying rucksacks, on the 12th of July, so 5 days after the bombings, and that they saw them on CCTV at King's Cross, and then they kind of traced that back up the line, back up the Thameslink route to Luton Station, and then got CCTV of them from Luton Station. The problem is, at the inquests in 2010, 2011, the detective inspector who was in charge of the CCTV recovery in the police investigation said, oh no, it was actually on the 11th, it wasn't on the 12th. And then it emerged that there was a CCTV viewing log from Luton Station showing that it was actually on the evening of the 10th that the police first turned up there and started looking at the CCTV. So, what are they doing in Luton on the 10th of July, only 3 days after these explosions, when, according to their testimony, they didn't have any reason to be in Luton? They hadn't identified them even in London at that point until the following day. So there is this recurring theme in the 7/7 investigation, and also in the sort of so-called intelligence failures beforehand, of them clearly knowing more than they let on. And this is, without trying to get too weird about all of this is why I picked the image that I did for the front cover of the book, which is you'll notice is a labyrinth with a surveillance picture of two of the alleged bombers in the middle of it.
The original surveillance picture before it was knocked away.
Yeah, before it was destroyed, and made almost meaningless. But anyway, the labyrinth is a reference to the myth of Theseus, and the reason why this is because the police investigation into 7/7 was called Operation Theseus. Now, Theseus was this guy who went to slaughter the Minotaur, this sort of beast, this legendary beast. There was a sort of half-man, half-bull thing that kept killing people. And the Minotaur lives inside a labyrinth, and one of the problems that people had was going into the labyrinth to try and fight it. They got lost, so Theseus takes along a ball of wool or something, so he lays down a trail for himself. He sort of ties the end of the ball round a post outside the labyrinth and then goes inside, so that when he gets to the end and finds the Minotaur and kills it, he can then find his way back out again. So what's the upshot of this? The upshot is he set down trail for himself to then follow. And this is the image that the British police used, conjured up when codenaming the 7/7 investigation. I don't want to sort of press that point too strongly, but I certainly thought it was odd enough as a sort of inspiration for the front cover of the book. That's what that's about, anyway. There is also this issue of them finding all this property, all this personal ID and mobile phones and what have you down in London, because they just found so much of it. They found Sadiq Khan's stuff at all 4 different locations. They found like 2 different mobile phones belonging to him, several bank cards, half a dozen letters. You know, they just... I mean, the suggestion is that Khan had just sort of, you know, grabbed everything that was on his, you know, desk in his study or whatever, shoved it in a bag, divided it up among the 4 of them before they went and got on these vehicles and blew themselves up. And that they sort of, you know, were just sort of walking around these trains chucking this stuff on the floor for a couple of minutes before they decided to kill themselves. Because otherwise, how on earth do you get all that stuff there? And how is it in such good condition? Even testimony at the inquest, they were saying, you know, this stuff doesn't look like it was right next to an explosion. It just looks like it was found at a bomb site. So it's just a completely implausible story. Both of these bits of evidence suggest, well, the CCTV suggests more knowledge at an earlier point than they pretended to have. And frankly, all the stuff in London, all this ID and what have you, it just smacks of planted evidence. I don't see what other sense you can really make of it.
I think it's worth reiterating as well that the state investigators and so on, they haven't proven anything about these 4 men in a court of law. There's no prosecution. They haven't been found guilty. There's been no cross-examination of evidence, no inquiry. Regardless of how it's framed in the media, the case is very much open, and I don't think people really realise that, do they?
No, I don't think they do, because they've been bombarded with it over and over and over and over again. We've heard this, you know, Mohammed Sadiq Khan and the others went to London and blew themselves up and killed 52 people, and they've just been repeating that endlessly at almost every opportunity that's presented itself for the last, well, nearly 8 years now. And I suppose if you just keep repeating something over and over again, particularly when you've got some predictive programming that's kind of predisposed people to believe this anyway, if you just keep repeating it, eventually people will believe it. No, the case is wide open. I mean, as I tried to argue this, I argued this to some extent in Crime and Prejudice, but I went even further in the book in saying, look, the evidence for these 4 men even being on those vehicles at the times of the explosions is pretty thin. It doesn't make much sense. In particular, the case with Sadiq Khan, his body wasn't found when they sent around someone to pronounce people dead at the scenes on the evening of the bombings. It wasn't found until 2 days later. How does it take you 2 days to find a body? Again, does this not smack of some kind of planting evidence at the scenes? I'm not saying that's definitively what happened. I'm just saying if you sort of take all this information cumulatively, you can't help but think that. You can't help but wonder, have these guys, you know, just been set up, and is all this sort of relatively coincidental, relatively strange evidence against them, is it all sort of not exactly faked and fabricated, but manipulated?
Well, let's get into the predictive programming stuff, because I think it's actually quite relevant along with this Woolwich fiasco. I talked at the start of the show there about Anjem Choudary, this extremist Muslim talking head. He's like the BBC's go-to guy to sort of legitimise the war on terror. They had him on the morning of 9/11, cementing that it was, you know, Muslims that did that. They spoke to him after 7/7. He was on Newsnight right after the Woolwich attack. The BBC clearly have an agenda, and I think the use of Choudary as this kind of archetypal evil Muslim is one of their more obvious uses of propaganda. If Chowdhury's on, you know they're concocting something, that they want a certain reaction from the public. But in terms of 7/7, you've explored in the book and on some other podcasts and things how, as you say, the BBC do appear to have shaped the narrative both after 7/7 and before it. You focused a lot in the book on the drama show Spooks. So just tell us a bit of the evidence and observations you've gathered that would suggest, predictive programming in all this.
Okay, well, the simple argument is that there's too many of the programs for it to be a coincidence. We're talking about there's 3 full series of Spooks that broadcast before 7/7, and in those 3 series there are maybe 5-6 episodes that are pertinent to what became talking points after the 7/7 attacks. You also have at least half a dozen other TV shows and films and what have you that also were playing with these same memes, playing with the same ideas, seeding these same sorts of narratives. So that adds up to 10, 12 TV shows in a 4-year period between 9/11 and 7/7. They're all by the state broadcaster, they're all by the BBC. Most of them have acknowledged that they had some kind of security service involvement in their production, in the sense, typically of having some ex-security service guy advising on the script or something, not in a sort of straightforward MI5 giving orders kind of a way. So all of this suggests to me that if they wanted to, they could do this. And when you watch the shows themselves, most of them you can still get online. You can just watch them for free. There just seems to be a pattern to this. In the whole of the first series of Spooks, basically the only mention of Muslims is as terrorists. The only Muslim terrorists. The only mention of suicide is when there's some Muslim terrorists. And it's just, over and over again, this is how their script played out. This is how their stories played out. Then you get into the second series, which broadcast in 2003, so 2 years before 7/7. In the second episode of that, you have a Muslim suicide bombing. That is the central storyline, and quite interestingly, I think, it's one of those few episodes where the spooks don't win. Normally in these kind of shows, the 24 or whatever, the good guys win. They manage to stop the terrorists, they manage to stop the big attack from happening and, save the world. And it's the same in Spooks, but in that particular episode they don't. This kid who's been kind of brainwashed by a character who's, basically Omar Bakri, himself, who's a sort of, maybe a pseudo-Islamist, or at least a very weird guy, Omar Bakri, and certainly a MI5 informant. Anyway, in this Spooks suicide bomber episode, a kind of radical preacher who's very much like Omar Bakri brainwashes this, 14-year-old Muslim lad into blowing himself up, and the kid actually goes through with it and kills himself. And also in that story, MI5 have a kind of double agent who's trying to stop this bombing, who infiltrates this mosque and this kind of radical group. And he is based very, very closely and very obviously on the real-life informant called Reda Hussein, who was an informant inside Al-Muhajirun. And the biography of the fictional character and the real spy are almost identical in terms of, what agencies they worked for, when, and sort of at what period of their life they got involved in all of this. And all, it's very, very obvious, the parallels. So they're clearly playing with reality and trying to sort of shape people's perceptions of the realities of the spying game, the war on terror, whatever you want to call it. And yeah, that was the first time we ever saw a Muslim suicide bomber on television in the UK. They predicted it in the first series, they showed it in the second series, and then the same scenario was broadly speaking, was put into that BBC Panorama show. The same scenario turns up in a film in 2004 called Dirty War. Again, you've got Muslim suicide bombers, and this time they even bomb Liverpool Street Station. It's just, you don't get all this happening by coincidence. You get it happening somewhat organically, but also because of, I think, some degree of manipulation. I mean, with that, the Muslim suicide bomber episode of Spooks in particular, when you watch the production feature on the DVDs, because me being a nerd for this kind of stuff, I've actually got the DVDs. But yeah, so I watched the production feature on this episode, trying to find out more about it, like you do. And they made some very strange statements, the people involved in making this show. The writer said he wanted to do a story. He wanted to do a story about a good Muslim. That's the spy, the one who's trying to stop the bombing. And he wanted to sort of set it in the Al-Qaeda world, and that he wanted to broach the subject of suicide bombing happening in Britain. And he said, because it's a sort of scenario that's obsessing our security services. Now, how does some scriptwriter know what scenarios are obsessing the security services unless they're telling him? Unless they're sort of saying, this is the sort of thing that, we're kind of worried about, and this is the sort of thing you might want to put in your scripts and kind of, deal with, that BBC phrase where they deal with issues.
If we play devil's
Sorry, go on.
advocate, even if, MI5 were kind of handing them ideas, I mean, that's probably what would happen if you was making an MI5 themed show on the BBC. Could it just be that MI5 were sharing their kind of nightmarish scenarios, even if they're not quite true to reality? Could it just still be a coincidence that way?
If they had only done it once, and if they'd sort of evidently done it with lots of different scenarios, and they were right with some of them and wrong with some of them, I'd say, yeah, okay, maybe it can be a coincidence. But when it's happening multiple times, and when you're not just getting the official story, I mean, that's the part of the analysis in my book that you basically don't find this, it seems, anywhere else in the discussion of predictive programming, is that this isn't just a mechanism for shaping people's perceptions of the future with regard to official stories. They weren't just selling the Muslim suicide bomber story. They were also selling to a certain extent, the Canary Wharf police snipers supposedly shot the bombers story. They were also selling the Peter Power exercise story. That turns up both in Spooks and in Dirty War in slightly different formats. So, and just in general, the whole show seems to be based around advancing the security state, around, that torture and assassination and all these things are actually necessary. So in the context of all of that, I just think it's got to be a real phenomenon. I can't tell you exactly how this would have played out. That thing about the scriptwriter and MI5, I'm kind of guessing there that that's what it might look like. But we do know that Spooks had ex-security service advisors, and from that guy's statements, it sounds like he must have been talking to them when he came up with this idea. So,
and I know in an article that you did for WideShut about Zero Dark 30, the CIA in particular are known for sort of influencing Hollywood, and they were very much involved with Zero Dark 30. It's kind of common over there.
Yeah, it's very formalised in the United States. The CIA have an Office of Public Affairs. They have an entertainment industry liaison. The current guy is a guy called Paul Barry, and he basically goes and chats up people in the entertainment industry and talks to people who want to make shows about the CIA and tries to get them to portray the CIA in a positive light. That's his sort of general mission, but I can only assume he also has specific responsibility for specific things that they want out there. And if you watch Zero Dark 30, it's kind of the most sort of pro-CIA movie you'll ever see, except maybe Argo, which, was made in much the same way at the exact same time. Over here, I mean, we barely even acknowledge that MI5 exists, so I'm pretty sure they do have a kind of director of public affairs, but he's not someone who rather obviously spends his time buttering up people at the BBC. I think it's done in a more informal way than that, a slightly more subtle way.
They're too busy sending people to the inquests.
yeah. But you know what this is kind of their stock in trade, is deceiving people. That's what they do for a living. So I can only assume they are quite sneaky about how they actually accomplish these things.
Well, what are you saying is the ultimate effect of these shows? I mean, the term predictive programming, but what does it really mean? Is it simply to make the concept of Muslim terrorism in Britain, was it just to make it more palatable to the public, to make them automatically jump to the designated enemy? Or is it more sinister than that even?
Well, I mean, the term predictive programming is firstly, it's a bit of a mouthful. All it really means, I think, is propaganda regarding the future. Just as you have propaganda about what's going on now, whether it be at home or in some foreign country or whatever, And just as you have propaganda about the past, World War II, whatever, you have propaganda about the future. You have a vested interest by certain people to shape the public perception of what might happen in the future, and if it does happen, who or what to blame. So part of it is about that, clearly. Part of it was about establishing this meme of Muslim suicide bombers at least 2, if not 3 years before they blamed this attack on Muslim suicide bombers. Part of it is also, I do think, about seeding some of these diversions, some of these kind of red herrings and decoys, because they turn up almost as often as the whole kind of suicide bomber thing does. And the sorts of people who, basically the sorts of people who are into alternative conspiracy theories are the sorts of people who watch shows like Spooks. So, they're the sorts of people who watch shows like The X-Files. So therefore, it's rather obviously aimed at that market and aimed at that audience. The ultimate effect of this is to kind of split people off. You have the mainstream public being subtly encouraged to believe the official story, and also being encouraged to view these kind of alternative stories about whatever exercises gone live, doesn't really matter which alternative story you pick, to view those kinds of stories with suspicion and with skepticism, because they're just thinking, oh well, that just sounds like something on Spooks. I mean, that's just a sort of fictional thing. That's not reality. For the people on the other side of the coin, it has sort of the inverse effect, because it's encouraging them to believe the alternative narratives, but without giving them any more evidence or information to go on. I mean, ultimately, watching an episode of Spooks doesn't tell you anything explicitly about 7/7. All it can really do is kind of throw you off and maybe shape your speculative perception of it. It doesn't give you any solid evidence about the culprits or anything like that. So it doesn't really add anything to the weight of kind of our argument, but it does still affect the dialogue that we have. And so for the mainstream public, they're being encouraged to see these things as kind of ridiculous. For the alternative public, they're kind of being encouraged to see these things as plausible. But neither one is actually being given any means to sort of further means to test this or any further evidence about it. So the dialogue can't go anywhere. It's a stalemate. It's a checkmate. It can't, what can you do with that discussion? All you've got is 2 different groups of people saying it was them and pointing to different people. It's not a conversation that can progress. And that's partly why what's happened with 7/7 has happened. That's partly why, to be honest, most people don't give a toss. It's because, where's the constructive dialogue on this issue? Where's the constructive dialogue on this case? I've found very little of it. So, I don't mean to sound kind of pessimistic. If I thought it was a lost cause and if I thought it was pointless, then I wouldn't have bothered writing a book about it. I'm just saying, one of the reasons to write this book is so that there is something out there that if people are interested in having a constructive dialogue, you can read this book and learn an awful lot of stuff that gives you the means to have a constructive dialogue.
Well, I hate to keep going back to Peter Power, but his interviews are obviously fundamental in the alternative theory camp. We've stressed many times he lacks any real relevance to the bombings themselves. The exercise was in an office, from what we can tell. He's not linked in any way to the alleged bombers, but I don't think we've ever really delved into why Peter Power went on TV. He's had quite a measurable effect on thousands of people's opinions about 7/7. He's central to most of the alternative theories, but what do you think his own motive was for revealing, what he was up to? Was he manipulated in some way to going on to the television? Was he on there to do manipulating himself? Like, what do you think his motive was?
Well, I mean, his personal motive, I can only assume, was sort of shameless self-promotion. I mean, think about what the man's doing. He's gone on the radio and the TV, and then TV in another country. So he's making sure this story is out there, both on this side of the Atlantic and in the United States and Canada. And he's basically exploiting a terrorist attack to go, look, I'm clever, I kind of predicted this. that's sort of what he's ultimately doing, which is kind of a pretty horrible thing to do, a pretty amoral thing to do, rather cynical thing to do. But none of that really indicates any kind of criminal complicity in the act itself. It indicates he's a rather unpleasant man, and that he's willing to exploit mass murder for his own ends. I mean, just watching and listening to those interviews again, and obviously I've listened to them quite a number of times, yeah, he just strikes me as a kind of a chancer, if you like, a guy who saw an opportunity and went for it.
And I remember seeing him pop up as well just before, I think it was either the Olympics or the royal wedding or something, but he was out there again kind of promoting his security.
Probably both.
Yeah,
he's quite good at getting himself on television, that man. And I think he may have also turned up in the commentary on the Boston bombings as well. I mean, he really is. He's like Anjem Chowdhury. He is a bit of a go-to guy. He's one of those guys that sort of keeps turning up over and over again in all these different places about all these different events, helping to shape ideas and shape the dialogue about it, and always, give himself a bit of a boost at the same time. So I can only assume that's what's in it for these kinds of people, is egotism, if nothing else.
And of course, whenever he pops up, it again refuels the alternative narrative to all of these kind of events, because it's Peter Power again, this must be dodgy.
Well, he is a dodgy guy. As J7, the July 7th Truth campaign, they did quite a lot of stuff on Peter Power's background, and basically he has this curious habit of turning up. He turned up at the Yvonne Fletcher shooting, he turns up at the King's Crossfire, he just keeps sort of, not every single time, but he keeps turning up at rather important events and being somehow involved in all of these. But that to me just sort of says, would this be the kind of guy that you would hang a big black operation on? If the whole point of Peter Power, let's say that his exercise was in some way connected with this, and that, I mean in a kind of physical sense, that this exercise was in some way being used to help carry out this attack, would you pick a dodgy ex-cop who, anyone with the time and inclination to do a bit of searching on him would find that he is pretty dodgy? Would you pick someone like that to draw, surely you'd be drawing too much attention to yourself. Surely you'd pick someone who looks a bit cleaner. So all of these things just suggest to me there's something different going on. If there is a connection, and I suppose statistically, even though the statistical likelihood of all of this, or unlikelihood of all of this, has been massively exaggerated, I do think there's some kind of connection between Peter Power's exercise and a real event, but I think the most likely connection is that it was playing into the predictive programming, it was playing into the psychological manipulation, playing into the dialogue that was being created around these events, rather than, he somehow hired these guys, or somehow hired other people who carried out the bombings, or whatever theory you might have along those kinds of lines. I do think that if you go back into the exercises, all the various training simulations and what have you that were being run in the years before 7/7, and you kind of line those up alongside the TV shows, you do notice a pattern, you do notice a lot of connections between these things. The same sorts of scenarios that appear in the TV shows also appear in the training exercises. And in particular, these training exercises before 7/7 seem to be more about preparing people. They seem to be serving the same purpose as predictive programming does in terms of shaping people's perceptions. So therefore, given all that data, I would say it just makes more sense that the Peter Power exercise was part of all that phenomenon. It just fits in better that way, I think. I just think there's more evidence suggesting that and pointing to that.
Well, if we jump back to predictive programming, what are some of the historical examples of this being used? I believe in your book you touched on Iraq and how things were kind of seeded for the run-up to the Iraq War.
Well, that's a slightly different thing in as much as that was about putting stories in the news rather than putting storylines in fictional TV shows. But yeah, same kind of thing. Basically, there was an operation, an MI6 operation called Mass Appeal, that was running from the late 1990s onwards and up until we invaded Iraq in March 2003. So this was running for several years before the event, and the whole point of it was to put stories into the press, into the media, the mainstream media, obviously, encouraging people to see Iraq as a threat, to buy into this whole weapons of mass destruction story, just generally to encourage the perception that invading Iraq was a good idea. And even despite all of that effort, obviously, lots and lots of people marched against it. And, as you pointed out at the top of the show, a lot of people didn't buy it, but they were trying. Clearly they were trying. And you can read about Operation Mass Appeal on the BBC's website and that kind of thing. It's not a disputed thing. I also went back all the way to the Second World War and had a look at some of the kind of propaganda policy papers that were knocking around at that time in the Ministry of Information, because it's wartime propaganda. If this is a war on terror, then I suppose we're at war, aren't we? So perhaps they're using the same sorts of methods. And in the Second World War, they used predictive programming. They used it specifically to try and condition people's responses to the German invasion that they thought was coming. I mean, that German invasion never actually happened, but nonetheless, they were trying to use both fiction and more kind of overt newsreel type propaganda to get people used to the idea that, firstly, the Germans could invade and might invade at any time, and secondly, that we will repel this and, we'll fight against it and we will survive and all the rest. So again, it's about seeding an idea, but also conditioning a response to that idea should it actually happen, should it actually become a real event. So I think it's been going on for a long time. I think it's a real phenomenon, and it's been going on for a long time.
Well, they're doing the same kind of thing with Iran. They've been doing it for many years. On my YouTube channel, there's a video of Tony Blair. I went back through all the Iraq war inquiry and picked out every different moment that he talks about Iran being a nuclear threat, and it's quite ridiculous. This guy's got no shame. He's warmongering against another country during an inquiry about an illegal war. He's sort of grandstanding and hijacking this inquiry into his previous war crimes to try and encourage some more war crimes. Yeah, I mean it's bloody ridiculous. Well, if we jump back to 7/7, for the longest time, I've kind of struggled with the fact that, on one hand, we know the official story is false. There isn't really even an official story when you get down to the detail. I described it as a rough draft when I was reviewing your book. They know what they want to say, but the detail and the prosecutable evidence, it just isn't there. So we could say, in regard to the law, those men aren't guilty. However, on the other hand, we've both retraced the intelligence data, what the men were doing before the attacks, who they were interacting with, supposed overseas links, things like that, which does suggest, at least kind of in a superficial way, I guess, that there's a motive, a kind of context for them possibly doing it. And in my film, I very much focused on that backstory. And for the longest time, my position basically was, well, if they did do it, they were coaxed along and provocateured, and they've got all these connections to probable informants, and maybe MI5 just deliberately failed to act. However, there still isn't that physical evidence from the day itself. So then you could say, well, maybe we just have a really bad investigators and they balls up all the evidence, but they still did do it, but they were provocateured. But what kind of took me a long time to fully grasp is your thesis that this backstory that implicates them might not have been about them being provocateured, but might actually just be a fake paper trail. I mean, is that basically what you're saying, that all these connections, it's actually just, it could just be hot air just put there?
Well, not so much that it could just be hot air. I mean, there is a lot of this stuff where you do wonder, was Mohammed Sadiq Khan actually in Pakistan at Junaid Barbar's training camp? I mean, Junaid Barbar says he was there, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. So some of it could just be made up. I suppose my explanation is more that, I mean, like you say, if these guys did do it, then it does seem that they were somehow kind of prodded along that path. My argument is more sort of, if they didn't do it, then someone set them up. And who would have the means and access to set them up, and who would have the motive for doing that? Why would anyone bother? And the sort of the answer to that, the only people who would bother are the same people who would bother sticking storylines in BBC TV shows. It's basically MI5. And I use MI5 in a sort of loose sense. I don't mean every single person inside MI5, and I don't mean just people within MI5. I mean, it could be people from other agencies as well. But the pattern that I found when I went through this kind of paper trail again, and this story that they've told and retold and revised and edited and expanded every single time that someone's gone back to MI5 and said, what did you know about these guys? What were you doing? What were you up to? They've sort of added more information to this. And each time they've added more information, they've added more stuff that sort of superficially incriminates these guys. But they've also, perhaps not very brightly, added stuff that's incriminated themselves. Because the pattern is basically this. You've got 4 men who, in the years between 9/11 and 7/7, do several things, such as visiting Pakistan and going to this supposed training camp, such as liaising with people who were going to end up in court convicted of being terrorist suspects. They do several things that might make them sort of look like they could be Muslim extremists, but only in a sort of namby-pamby and rather vague way. And every time they do one of these things, they do it in connection with one of these 3 men, Martin McDade, Junaid Barbar and Q, that we've discussed at some length. And every time they connect up to these guys, there are significant, if not massive, intelligence failures. Information not being shared, people not making obvious connections, people not chasing things up and finding information that they already had, that sort of thing. It happened over and over again. And it's not just like we're talking sort of 2-3 times across a 5-year period. We're talking every single time they had any information, particularly on Sadiq Khan, they managed to sort of balls it up in some way. And every time that they did this, those intelligence failures, as they call them, managed to obscure the relationship between the alleged bombers and these 3 guys who I suspect of being secret agents. So is that, I suppose what I'm suggesting is that not the hallmark, if you like, the hallmark of a black operation, is that information was being restricted and it wasn't being shared and it wasn't just sort of being put around to everyone within MI5. It was being kept within a very, very small group in order that they could kind of keep these guys off the map, or at least keep their relationships with these 3 secret agents, probable secret agents, off the map. And the ultimate effect of all this, and I understand I'm kind of saying all that without really giving any examples, but if you want the examples, I provide copious ones in the book. The upshot of all of this is that we didn't even know who some of these 3 men, these 3 secret agents, were. We didn't even know their names until years after 7/7. And they never turn up as part of the official police investigation. They're never arrested. They're never interrogated or in any way to do with these attacks. So it's not a cast iron case that you can make, but there is a distinct pattern of behaviour there. And it's an incriminating pattern of behaviour, because it suggests that MI5 were deliberately failing to follow up on information and deliberately failing to investigate and deliberately failing to draw connections between people, because all of it suited their agenda. It suited their whole war on terror thing to be in the process of kind of it's this sort of conveyor belt of terrorist suspects that they needed to just kind of put through the courts in order to create the perception of a big threat. And it seems relatively obvious that they've done that. Particularly the FBI in the United States keep getting caught using informants to basically entrap people. And they do the same thing over here, they're just more secretive about it. And I'm just wondering, is the extension of that you use the same methods of sort of provocation and manipulation, of getting people to do the odd thing that makes them look guilty, but then you fail to investigate, you deliberately don't follow up on that, so that 3-4 years down the line, it doesn't look like you had any real information on them, when you did, and when you were provoking them, and when you were creating a backstory for these guys, precisely so that you could then blame them for this terrorist attack. That's kind of the case that I'm making, just because when I actually went into their paper trail and just sort of reconstructed this timeline of what they knew, what information they had, at what point, and what they actually did with it, or didn't do with it more often, that's the pattern to me. It just strikes me as a pattern of incriminating behaviour.
And I guess if an average person heard you say all this, implying that MI5 are dodgy and might not always have our best interests at heart, they might think that's a completely ridiculous thing to say. But in your work, you've got numerous historical examples of people being set up, or getting the wrong people all together, or certain elements of collusion and lie hop during the Irish Troubles. You even draw parallels to events as far back as the late 1800s. I mean, have these institutions ever not been involved in some kind of shenanigans?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, that's the whole purpose of a security institution, isn't it? Not to be flippant, or I'm trying not to sound flippant, but how does a security service operate? Why does a security service need to exist? The only way anyone would actually think that it's a good idea to have secret policemen is if they're frightened, of something, is if they think otherwise something horrible will happen to them. So it's I suppose it is theoretically possible that you could have a secret service that doesn't sooner or later attack its own citizens in some way, but I haven't come across one. Sooner or later they all do it just because they have the motive to do it, they have a self-preserving motive to do it, and they have the ability to do it because they operate in so much secrecy that they hardly ever get caught.
Well, the final chapter of your book is how to solve 7/7. So how do we solve 7/7? How do we move forward with this information? How do we kind of take this a step forward?
Well, that's a really hard thing, because in the book I went as far as I could with the resources I have in trying to investigate this, and the book is basically me presenting what I found. There isn't an awful lot more that I personally can do. So some people will read the book and think, I've already got a solid enough case of, between me, you and J7, we've found enough information that we've probably figured out as much as we're going to figure out with this thing. You know what, maybe that's actually true. But on the other hand, there are several models for investigation that have to some extent worked, have to some extent got somewhere. I'm thinking of the inquiries into Gladio and the inquiries into collusion in Northern Ireland, the Oklahoma bombing, it's independent investigation. So it is kind of possible to do that, to actually develop some kind of independent, or at least nearly independent investigation that can actually look at all this stuff seriously, that has some kind of legal authority and some kind of funding and some kind of ability to actually dig some stuff up here. All of that's possible, and it has been accomplished in several different countries at several different times. I doubt that it will happen with 7/7, if only because MI5 are so good at this. They're so good at secrecy, they're so good at covering things up, that they've done very, very well at not just covering it up, but also making people apathetic about it. They still managed to invoke 7/7 as the justification for anti-terrorism laws, but not that many people seem to care that much about it anymore. It doesn't have the shock impact that it once did. And on the other side, most people in the alternative media just were sort of given up talking about it. They'd rather talk about something more recent, like Boston or whatever. So we have to try and overcome that apathy and try and challenge that apathy and find ways to make people still care about these things. Because, like I say, it is important. It's a crime. It's a mass murder. And even if we can't necessarily solve it, even if we can't necessarily find some named people to bring to justice, I suppose at least we could, I don't know, harass them a bit, by make them worry a bit, so in the hope that they won't do it again, by showing that, you know, if people are going to try and do this, we're kind of on them, and when we're going to sort of try and stop them from doing it, that we're on the case, that we've got an ability to challenge them over this. How to solve it? Well, basically, we'd need a lot of evidence that we don't currently have. I list some of it in the book. Most of the physical evidence has been destroyed, so I just don't think the forensic case would get us anywhere now. I just don't think there's enough evidence left that we could derive much from that. Maybe answer a few of the questions, but I don't think we could sort of solve the case that way. I think the case at this point would lie in the so-called intelligence failures and in the predictive programming. And if we can get more information on either one of those, either by sort of forcing MI5 in some way to publish everything it's got on this, because they are withholding a lot, or forcing the BBC. I mean, the BBC is subject to freedom of information. It is potentially subject to any sort of proper investigation or inquiry. So maybe drag them out and say, what were you doing with these TV shows, and where did you get these ideas, and who suggested all this stuff to you? And maybe that would generate some leads, and maybe that would actually take us to some of the people who were involved in all of this.
And perhaps if we're in a rut now, that doesn't mean in the future perhaps some other kind of incident will happen that will kind of make people, you know, wonder about the state, and then we've got this information here, and if people go back and then re-look at everything because a new event has sparked interest, then maybe that could have a sort of snowballs effect. I don't know.
Yeah, it's always possible. And like I said earlier, I didn't write this book in the hope of it sparking off some great big new investigation and waking lots of people up and all of that kind of stuff that people talk about. I'm not interested in that. I'm just interested in this needed to be done. There needed to be a really good book on 7/7. So I wrote it. And I hope people buy it, because to be honest, I've invested a fair amount of money in doing this. So I could do with selling it. But, you know, I'm not doing this to make money. If I broke even on all of this, I'd be perfectly happy. So, yeah, I hope people do buy the book, if only just because you probably like it. Tell me, have you ever read a book sort of quite like this one before?
Well, in terms of 7/7, it's definitely brought some new things to the table. I mean, I don't think anyone's approached it as level-headed as you have. I mean, in many ways, you kind of snapped me out of some of the kind of cul-de-sacs and red herrings and things, and kind of got me on track. I mean, I'd like to thank you in that regard.
Oh, no worries, Keelan. I mean, we've had a very productive dialogue on this, which has helped very much in terms of writing the book, because, you know, having someone to bounce a few ideas off, it helps you to see some of the flaws in your own reasoning and where you might be going with this. But, I just felt that the book needed to exist so that if people are curious and if people do want to just be able to go to one place and get an abundance of information on this and a load of references for them to check and follow up if they want to find out more about whatever aspect of the case it is that might interest them, that thing does exist, because it's important. Like I say, if you believe that something should exist in the world and it doesn't, you know, try and invent it yourself. So yeah, that's what I did.
Well, before we go today, I also want to get your take on the Woolwich murder. At least officially, blowback for the wars overseas seems to at least have an element of being a possibility, and also kind of a second layer of blowback coming from this alleged torture in Kenya that one of the suspects was supposed to have suffered, which you could argue would send anybody loopy and a bit violent if you was subjected to some of the horrific things that they do. But also this info about MI5 harassing and being involved with one of the suspects was put out there by BBC again. So perhaps are we seeing a sort of limited hangout by MI5 and the BBC?
Well, I suppose that is a possibility. It is curious that information A came out so quickly after the murder, and B came out on Newsnight, wasn't it? This guy was interviewed.
It was
So-
the BBC. I'm not sure which particular.
Yeah. In any case, it is a bit odd that this story about the guy being followed around by MI5 for a long, long time, and that they apparently tried to recruit him as an informant. It is odd that they were covering a story like that within days of the attack, within days of the murder. So maybe it's a
like
limited day
Boston,
hangout.
really.
It is a bit like Boston, yeah. The information about Boston, about Tamlin Tsarnaev, that was only a few days after that we were already talking about this. So maybe you could see that as some kind of victory for us, that we've at least managed to force the news agenda, the mainstream news agenda, to have to talk about these things more and talk about them more quickly. On the other hand, the whole thing could be a kind of gigantic distraction. I don't know. I mean, let's see. It seems that those guys actually did it. That they did actually commit the murder, and it doesn't seem that they're disputing that. Yeah, I suppose in this particular instance, the whole blowback thing might be accurate. As a kind of general explanation for acts of terrorism, I don't buy into it, because there just doesn't seem to be an awful lot of evidence in so many of the cases that people discuss. But in this particular one, it does seem that this guy was kind of, if you like, chewed up and spat out by the war on terror, and therefore ended up doing something terrible, and terribly stupid. So yeah, it could be, if you like, a backlash, in some way, a product of us instituting this war on terror paradigm on the world, is that sooner or later some piece of kind of human wreckage is going to get so twisted up and so hurt by all of this that something like this is going to happen. And ultimately, like you said in your article, and like we've said in chatting about this, it is only one murder. It is a murder, and the guy died horribly, and that's terrible for him, and pretty horrible for his family, I expect. But it is ultimately one murder. It isn't, to my mind, an act of terrorism. I mean, what does terrorism even mean if you're going to apply it to things like this? It could mean anything. So, on the other hand, there is, it seems, some kind of political and to some extent religious motivation for this. So it's a little difficult to understand precisely what to make of it, but as per usual, Al-Muhajirun are hanging around in the background.
And something I think you'll get a kick out of, because we've touched on this before, but there's an article here in The Independent linking the Woolwich suspect to Mohammed Hamid, the Don't Panic I'm Islamic guy. I'm just going to read out this paragraph. One of the suspects in the murder of Drummer Lee Rigby is believed to have had contact with a terrorist instructor now in prison for running military-style training camps which were used by Islamist extremists, including the 21/7 London bombers, The Independent has learnt. And then there's the link to his profile, and the title of his profile is Mohammed Hamid one of Britain's most prominent recruiting sergeants for Islamist extremism. He used to call himself Osama bin Laden.
No, he did briefly call himself Osama bin Laden, which is kind of a funny name, to be honest. He didn't come up with that. Someone else came up with that. Someone else called him that, and then he kind of amusingly, or at least with the intent, amusingly adopted it. But no, I mean, Mohammed Hamid wasn't anything. He was a guy who, him and a bunch of lads basically went camping in the woods and things like that. They weren't up to anything that even remotely resembles military training. They were just sort of jumping over rivers and doing forward rolls and kind of playing with sticks and things. It was a bit kind of childish given how old these men were, but that's the kind of worst thing you could say about it. Realistically, the worst thing you could say about it. And
I went back and actually watched that program, Don't Panic, I'm Islamic, and I was sharing it with someone on Skype today, and we were having a good laugh about this guy because he's a humorous guy. Like he's joking when he's calling himself Osama bin Laden. It's not like he really is some crazy. It's ridiculous how. I guess this is another example of how the media can create a narrative based on complete nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I touched upon the Hamid case in a few minutes of Crime and Prejudice. And one of the clips I used was from an interview with Phil Reese, who is this television producer, who's done some very good stuff. He did Don't Panic, I'm Islamic. He also did one called At Home with the Terror Suspects, which is also very good. And he knew Mohammed Hamid. He was one of the guys who was making this BBC show, Don't Panic, I'm Islamic, where they took Hamid paintballing, and this was then used as some of the evidence against him. So what, he was organising terrorism recruitment trips with the BBC. I mean, how does that add up? Anyway, and after the trial, I mean, Hamid was found guilty somehow, and chucked in prison for several years. He's still there. I mean, hopefully he'll be out sooner rather than later. But after his trial, Phil Reese went on I think it was Channel 4 News, and he was saying, this guy he's an open book. Basically, was the phrase he used. That there's nothing secretive and strange about him. He just is what he is. What you see on the camera, this rather zany guy who is prone to making some slightly kind of dark humour jokes and perhaps isn't the most sensitive and intelligent man you'll ever meet in your life. But none of that makes him a terrorist. None of that makes him a sort of Al-Qaeda recruiter or whatever they try and paint him as in the media. Yeah, it just makes him a person. Yeah, it just makes him a human being. I quite like the guy. From what I know about him, from what I can see about him, I quite like the guy, and I think what's happened to him is terrible. And the fact that they're trying to link him up to this Woolwich thing just seems sort of, I mean, that's so thin and so kind of tenuous. Not just their description of Hamid, but I mean, what's the actual connection between them? What are they saying is the actual evidence for them in some way being involved together?
Well, literally the line is believed to have had contact with a terrorist instructor now in prison, blah blah blah. So it's just like believed to have met this guy once, maybe on his stall out in London or whatever.
Well, I don't know, maybe they bumped into each other at some kind of Al-Muhajirun meeting, or I mean, God knows where they might have potentially met. But yeah, that's so thin and so kind of. Yeah, this whole event, you're right, it has, if nothing else, been exploited by the mainstream media to kind of revive and reinflate this whole Islamist terrorist narrative in Britain. Because, of course, since 7/7, not that I believe 7/7 was done by Islamic terrorists, but since then, not an awful lot's happened in this country. We had those two idiots who drove into Glasgow airport and set themselves on fire. But that's about the sum total of the terrorism in this country since 7/7. I honestly can't think of any other serious event. So
the sad thing is, this Mohammed Hamid, he's going to come out of jail, and I'm guessing he's going to be quite angry. Now, maybe he's not going to act on that anger, but maybe someone in a different circumstance, maybe like this Woolwich guy, after being completely abused by the system, it's going to radicalise them even more, even if they weren't radicalised to start with. It is a war against the Muslims because they're putting them in jail for no reason.
Well, and they're killing lots of them. And killing lots of just innocent people. And yeah, of course I can see. I mean, if nothing else, history tells us, what history tells us is that most, if you want to call them terrorists, but okay, most political militants of any type are people who've got angry at usually the state doing horrible things to people. In the whole kind of history of what we call terrorism, which is about 150 years old, it didn't really exist before then, not in the same way at all. That's the recurring theme, is that oppressive state systems have bred, as a kind of backlash, as a kind of reaction, chemical reaction to that repression, have bred militancy, have bred people who are desperate enough to think that, you know, running some guy over and then hacking at him with a big butcher's knife is some kind of good idea, is somehow going to get you somewhere. Because it's a bloody stupid idea. I mean, that's horrendously wrong. But like you say, why does someone end up thinking like that? Why does someone end up thinking that's a good idea? Well, if they've been arrested, or if they've been harassed, and if they've been tortured, and if they've been sort of generally subjected to the kinds of prejudice and repression and pain and suffering, and they've seen a lot of pain and suffering as well, they're much more likely to think this is actually a normal way to behave and a right way to behave. And so, I mean, you're never going to be able to completely stop someone from doing something like that. And we have to be careful, as always, that this whole intelligence failures thing around him doesn't become another excuse to clamp down, and another excuse to pass more legislation, and another excuse to just give more power and authority to the security services, because they're very good at doing that, at exploiting events to do that kind of thing. But I think you can never sort of stop terrorism entirely, of course. But what you can do is live in a more peaceful and just society where people have far less motive for doing this kind of thing.
Well, it's like anything. We're humans. There's gonna be violence. It's like I wrote in my article. Just because somebody's, you know, broken up with their girlfriend and then gone and beat her up or something, or the chap that she slept with or whatever, you don't then go around persecuting every single person that's broken up with their girlfriend. Human nature, bad things do happen sometimes. We don't have to be wrapped in cotton wool. We're never going to live in a perfect society.
No, certainly not. And just that, what kind of society do you want to live in? What is this perception of safety and security that we're sold with, but we can never attain, we can never actually get? You know, what would you really want all of that? Would you want what you'd have to give up in order to get that kind of a society? I don't think very many people would at all. So, yeah, just an awful lot of this just should come down to, you know, what kind of society do you want to live in? What kind of world do you want to live in? What kind of values do you want to see succeed? Rather than being about some, you know, fight with the BBC or fight with some other institution or something. I do think people just kind of fundamentally need to get back to, what do you want to see in the world? What do you want the world to be, and try and create it.
And something else that goes along with this this silly independent article, there's also this is out of Foreign Policy magazine or something, but all of a sudden there's now a new issue of the Al-Qaeda English-speaking magazine, which is interestingly called Inspire, and apparently they're now praising the Boston bombers, and this is like a new headline that you know, Al-Qaeda are supporting these guys.
Inspire might as well be called Provoke.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's very odd. I mean, what the hell have Al-Qaeda got to do with the Boston bombers, or so-called Boston bombers? I mean, they were Chechens.
Right.
They haven't really got much connection to, you know, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, all of that. Yeah, that strikes me as just another example of the Inspire magazine being used to sell some nonsense.
Yeah.
I mean, That's some pretty terrible journalism that the Independent's managed there. I mean, I know the mainstream media isn't great, but the Independent is, I would like to think, sometimes better than some of the others, but that's really bad. That's really just sort of really misleading stuff that, I don't know, we'd probably just do best to ignore it as much as possible.
Well, speaking of the Boston bombings, have you had any more thoughts about what happened there? I know last time we spoke you were considering perhaps that Russia was playing a role somewhat in this, and it wasn't just your typical US kind of provocateur event. Have you had any more thoughts on that whole thing?
Well, I haven't really changed my mind all that much, because I haven't had any reason to. As this story has progressed, and in particular after the Russians kidnapped and deported that CIA agent that they found wandering around Moscow in a silly wig, it all just sort of feeds into my perception that this is some kind of Cold War thing, or Cold War version 2, whatever you might call it. And in particular, the opposing theory to what I was suggesting, to what I've suggested, is that this was some kind of backdoor, some kind of CIA thing to carry out this bombing as part of a backdoor deal that would let, what was it being suggested, that would let Russia take Chechnya, go back into Chechnya and blast the hell out of the rebels, if the Russians backed off from Syria and let NATO take Syria. But if anything, the opposite seems to have happened. The Russians have moved quite a lot of powerful anti-aircraft weaponry into Syria so they can protect themselves against more of these sort of Israeli aircraft raids or anything like that. If anything, NATO were sort of wavering a bit on Syria and maybe looking like they're backing off. So if anything, it looks like the other way around, and I would suggest, purely hypothetically, because I really don't know, that if anything, this might have been a Russian bombing, Russian state-sponsored bombing, in order to get NATO to back off, in order to say enough's enough. If you persist with this thing in Syria, then we're going to not only bomb your cities, but also put the sorts of stories into the press about your security services relationship with these radical Islamic groups, because that's what RT has done, and the Russian media in general has done since Boston, is very much kind of point out the connections between these guys and the FBI and the CIA, and more broadly their sort of involvement, the CIA and MI6's involvement in Chechnya and lots of other places with the Islamic radicals. So I would suggest, if anything, that's how I would interpret it. But I don't know. I've not looked into it in any great detail since then.
Okay, well, I think that about wraps things up. We've gone about an hour and 20 minutes here, and the full show's gone nearly an hour and 40 minutes. As always, a thought-provoking conversation. Just tell people again where they can get your book, Secrets, Spies and 7/7, and anything else you want to say in closing.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you do feel inspired to get the book. If you want the ebook version, you can get it from all the major places that sell ebooks, Amazon, iTunes, Barnes & Noble, Kobo. It's on all of those. If you want the paperback, you can only get it by my website, investigatingtheterror.com. And just check into that site and spyculture.com for what I'm up to. And if this book goes reasonably well, I suppose I'm going to have to write another one. In fact, I'll probably just write another one regardless of whether this one goes well, because I like writing. And like I say, it doesn't cost anything to really publish an ebook, so I can certainly carry on doing that for forever.
Well, I very much look forward to any future books that you do. So thanks again, Tom, and I look forward to more interesting conversations in the coming months and years and as we go on.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on the show again, Keelan. Good talking to you.
No worries. Thanks again. There he goes, folks. That was Tom Secker of investigatingtheterror.com and spyculture.com. I'm going to call it a night there. Thanks to all those for tuning in, and The video, of course, will now archive on YouTube. I'm just scanning the comments, and it looks like there was a little bit of problem with my mic being lower than Tom's. So either, if the archive is really poor, what I'll do is just delete it and replace it with a recording my end, because I did record the Skype call as well, so we'll sort all that out. But from me, Keelan Balderson, I'll catch you another week. We've not got anything particularly lined up in terms of a schedule. Obviously, I'm not doing this every week right now, but yeah, I'll catch you all sometime in the near future. Playing us out is our old friend Imani Hakima, and this is an instrumental called Skin, Flesh and Bones.